Good day, everyone. Welcome to this session focused on the potential synergies between REDD+ and forest landscape restoration, and also on the views of stakeholders on the implementation of these two concepts. First of all, I would like to remind you that this session is going to be recorded, and the recording will be used afterwards in different media, for example, the IUFRO YouTube channel. Also, I would like to mention that, as it has been said before, the session is simultaneously translated into French and Spanish for those who want to follow us in those languages. And also that at the end of the panel discussion, we will have time for some questions. So you can already think about them during the discussion and post them through the Q&A function of the platform. Or I think people here in the audience should have a QR code where they can post their questions. And with that, let me begin with a brief introduction of who we are. The International Union of Forest Research Organizations, or IUFRO for short, is a not-for-profit, non-governmental international cooperation network of forest scientists that promotes global cooperation in forest-related research and enhances the understanding of the ecological, economic, and social aspects of forests and trees. Within IUFRO, the Global Forest Experts Panel Program, or GFEP, combines diverse expertise to assess scientific knowledge about the role of forests and trees in achieving the global goals and inform political decision-making. A few months ago, GFEP published a report that I have here. Yeah, you can see it. This report summarizes and analyzes the current scientific knowledge regarding the REDD+ effects in forest, climate, biodiversity, and people. The effects that REDD+ had on this during the last decade. This report was used as the base to conduct a stakeholder consultation. The outcome of this consultation has been published also. During this consultation, we received the answers of almost 200 stakeholders from Asia and Latin America. And these two reports and more information on this project can be found on our website, and also you can request physical copies of the reports through the email that you will find in the chat. One of the chapters of the report highlighted the cross-learning potential between REDD+ and FLR. And to tell us more about this, we have with us today Dr. Stephanie Mansourian, who was lead author of this chapter that highlights the potential synergies and issues between these two concepts. And she was also one of the editors of the report. Dr. Mansourian is a freelance environmental consultant and is also an IUFRO office holder. Please, Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nelson. I'm going to try to share my screen now. Bear with me a minute. I hope that will work. So, can you see my screen?
Yes, now we can see it.
Yeah, that should work, right? You can see it? I'm not hearing anything. Can someone tell me if you can see my screen?
We can see it.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for this introduction, Nelson. So I'm pleased to present the findings from our chapter on behalf of my co-authors, Amy Duchel, Bascavira, and Cesar Sabogal. I'm not able to get the presentation to actually work. There we go. Okay. So this chapter, we looked specifically at REDD+ challenges and lessons learned, as well as this cross-learning dimension with forest landscape restoration that is of interest to us today. So in exploring these issues, we found 9 overarching challenges and with a range of sub-challenges and 9 lessons. So this is now on REDD+ implementation. And we differentiated these challenges based on whether they were about governance and institutions, whether they were related to management and technical aspects, or financial aspects. We also looked at the scale at which those challenges intervened, whether they were at the international level, the national, the local, or indeed cross-sectoral, cross-scale levels. And then the final point, which is of interest to us today, is then we explored some of this cross-learning between forest landscape restoration and REDD+. And we chose to do that for a number of reasons, not least because last year was the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So just taking a step back, forest landscape restoration was defined in 2000 as a planned process that aims to regain ecological integrity and enhance human well-being in deforested or degraded landscapes. So some of the key issues about FLR, or forest landscape restoration, are that it takes place on a large scale. It takes place across landscapes. It's also a process that takes time. And importantly, it's got the 2 dimensions, the social and the ecological. So it's trying to restore a landscape, a forested landscape, so that it can fulfill its functions for both people and biodiversity. So if we look then at FLR and REDD+, the obvious link is on the 5th set of activities under REDD+, the enhancing of carbon stocks. But I would argue that FLR actually contributes or is useful for all 5 of the activities under REDD+. So FLR is not just about enhancing carbon stocks, but you also need to reduce deforestation, you need to reduce degradation, you need to look at management of forests as well as protection if you are to achieve an effective, sustainable landscape that you've restored. So in this slide, I just want you to focus on the year 2010. So what this slide is trying to show is key political milestones for REDD+ on the top half of the slide and FLR on the bottom half. But we find that in the last 20 years, it's really in the last 10 years that a lot of action has taken place. So in 2010, there was the COP decision on REDD+. Just a year later, for FLR, there was the Bonn Challenge that was launched in 2011. The Bonn Challenge is a commitment, or rather is an initiative by IUCN and the German government to engage other countries to restore 150 million hectares of forested landscape by 2020 and 350 million hectares by 2030. It's no coincidence this happened just a year after the Cancun Agreement in 2010. And then we can see after that, I've only listed some key milestones, but there's a flurry of activity that has taken place in both REDD+ and FLR in the last 10 years or so. So now if we go back to some specific cross-learning that we explored in our chapter. So one thing that we did is we looked at another report by John Stantup under the umbrella of BioFro, which looked at 19 landscapes where FLR was taking place. And this was published in 2020 together with a range of other researchers. And we basically looked at lessons coming out of these 19 landscapes. Last year, we also looked at lessons coming out from 7 landscapes where FLR was being implemented. And we looked at the lessons coming out of these exercises on FLR with the ones coming out of our report on REDD+. And we found when we categorized these lessons that we could cluster them under 13 categories, which you can see here. I won't go through all of the categories, but if we take, for example, addressing threats and drivers, that's a major issue for both FLR and REDD+. Unless we can actually address those drivers that are leading to deforestation and forest degradation, neither FLR nor REDD+ can actually be successful. So that's a key lesson coming out of both exercises, both from studying both mechanisms. Another one, if we look at the last one, the importance of local ownership and actually bring more of that decision-making power at the local level. At the end of the day, this is where the action takes place, and this is where sustainability can happen. Unless we get the local communities and the local authorities engaged and empowered, then be it FLR or REDD+, it's not going to succeed. Now, just a couple of specific lessons coming out, looking first from FLR to REDD+. We find, for example, that FLR has been a bit affected, let's say, by a tendency for top-down prioritization exercises. So there have been a series of maps that have been published, for example. There have been a lot of these targets on huge amounts of hectares. That has taken place in a top-down fashion. And that's not necessarily, as I was just saying, the way that we're going to succeed in the long term to reach sustainable landscapes that we want to restore. And that's something that is also of relevance to REDD+. Another one is related. Funding has often been stuck at higher levels, even if there are great commitments and great engagement, and we're seeing that at these COPs, and it's really important that we do need more funding, but it also does need to actually reach the local landscape. And we often find this disconnect. Even if it reaches the national level, it might not actually make it down to the landscape level, and that's where the funding is needed. Now, if we look the other way around, some of the positive lessons maybe coming out of REDD+ that could be of use to FLR, the whole institutional setup that went along with REDD+ since the early days, that's something that could be beneficial for FLR. So without wanting to overburden the FLR process, it's true that FLR has taken place in a bit more of an ad hoc fashion and hasn't had some of these structures at the national level or even at the local level that have gone with REDD+. So maybe that's something that could be useful for FLR. And similarly, the safeguards that have come, the biodiversity and social safeguards that have come with REDD+, that's something that could be potentially useful for FLR as well. So I want to leave you with 3 key messages. The first one is that forest landscape restoration is not just about enhancing carbon stocks. It's about all 5 of the REDD+ activities. It's about reducing deforestation. It's about reducing forest degradation. It's about sustainable forest management, and also about conserving existing forests. Second message is that both forest landscape restoration and REDD+ are about much more than climate mitigation mechanisms. So the whole essence of forest landscape restoration really is to restore a landscape so that it can fulfill its role for humanity and biodiversity. And what we found through this process is that it is really valuable to actually take a step back and look at lessons from mechanisms such as forest landscape restoration and REDD+, and to see what we can learn from them with the intention of influencing and supporting future initiatives in both forest landscape restoration and REDD+. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie, for this presentation. Thank you for the presentation that nicely sets up the context for this whole session. And to know more about the feasibility, cost, benefits, and trade-offs of implementing forest landscape restoration, we have with us today Dr. Pablo Pacheco. Dr. Pacheco is the Global Forest Lead Scientist at WWF, and also he collaborates with IUFRO through the WFSC program. Dr. Pacheco, the floor is yours.
I don't have audio, Nelson. Yeah, well, I was not hearing you, but now it seems that we have the audio. Well, thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking you for all the organizers of this session to be in this session with you. And as it was already mentioned by Stephanie, REDD and FLR frameworks share some key ingredients and they be complementary in their ultimate goals. We know that REDD focuses on very much on forest-based actions aimed at mitigating climate change, and FLR at regaining ecological functionality in integrated forest landscapes. Both FLR and REDD goals are complementary, also since we are certain now that we must address climate change and nature loss as a twin crisis. We know that nature loss contributes to climate change, and climate change places additional stress on nature. So while opportunities arise from REDD Plus and FLR frameworks for scaling forest restoration, to enhancing carbon removals and reversing biodiversity loss, also there could be some risks as well by focusing on shorter term, most cost-effective, and easier to scale up nature climate solutions. I'm not going to expand on REDD, but I will give a bit more of perspective on forest restoration and FLR. Many would say that forest restoration is not new, yet the need to achieve global climate targets has increased the urgency to halt forest loss and scale up forest restoration. Many promises of funding have been done and continue being made to support FLR, and there are big hopes that FLR will continue mobilizing public and private finance to restore ecosystem services, leading to positive outcomes on people and also on the overall economy. But there are different perspectives on forest restoration. Some have strongly argued in favor of tree planting as one of the most cost-effective carbon removal options. Others tend to privilege ecological restoration by assisting the natural recovery of degraded forest ecosystems. And another groups argue that local social needs should be at the center of forest restoration options. And moving beyond these narratives, and when we look at the implementation of FLR, there are already a few things that we have learned. Some of these are as follows. Technical and social feasibility of forest restoration depend on the context. Forest restoration is not just about tree planting, but mainly about tree growing. While carbon removals are important, forest restoration is not just about carbon. Outcomes depend on the portfolios of forest restoration options that are adopted in the specific places. Not in all cases win-win outcomes for climate, nature, and people can be achieved. And finally, trade-offs can be expected between ecological and economic outcomes. Let me refer to some of these with a bit more of detail. And we have learned that feasibility of forest restoration depends on multiple factors, ecological, social, institutional, etc. Assessments are suggesting that clear ownership on land or restored forest is key. Also, finance is key and is required, but financial institutions are expected to obtain competitive financial returns. And landholders, they want to achieve multiple benefits at once. Also, different options are being combined under FLR approaches, and not all of these options, they have the same costs and benefits. Also, and over time, we have seen that the preferred forest restoration intervention has been the establishment of tree plantations, frequently on monocultures, and also woodlots on smallholder farms, or to form shelter belts and windbreaks on agricultural lands. But also agroforestry systems have been extensively used in the tropics and subtropics with different purposes. It's possible to say that interventions have so far framed within an approach of favoring productive restoration, but also ecological restoration is critical worldwide in restoration initiatives. But unfortunately, we don't have the data on how these different options are shaping current forest restoration. And also, we don't have much data on costs, which is very limited and fragmented. So, but from what we know, available estimates suggest that the least costly options are natural restoration, passive and active, and also monocrop plantations when we compare with agroforestry. But agroforestry is the system in which we can obtain wider socioeconomic and environmental benefits. But it's important to say that these costs are underestimated because often the available figures that we have, they don't take into account indirect costs. And there are costs related to planning, coordination, monitoring, and capacity development, all of which demand of investment. And what we have seen so far is that carbon removals, which is one of the benefits of forest restoration, often cannot pay for much of these costs. So there's different sources of finance that should come together. Also, in many cases, carbon accounting becomes more difficult when we look at more complex systems like agroforestry, and there are not always the capacities in place for quantifying and reporting on carbon. There can be possibilities and options to reduce costs, but there cannot be many economies of scale that could be obtained through the processes of forest restoration. Technologies could be helpful to facilitate knowledge sharing, monitoring, and also to build risk profiles of farmers, etc. But I would say that's more importantly is to have the enabling conditions in place and a strong engagement of local stakeholders in leading the restoration process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. Now we for sure understand better the issues of implementing FLR. I would like to remind the audience that if you have any questions or comments, you can already post them through the Q&A function. And if you are here in person, you can use this QR code that is on the screen to send your questions. And now, to learn more about some experiences on the ground on capacity building related to FLR, we have with us Dr. Michael Kleiner. Dr. Kleiner is the coordinator of the SPDC program at IUFRO. This is the special program for development of capacities. Welcome, Michael. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nelson. First of all, thank you much for the invitation. So, as you mentioned, the special program for development of capacities is, as GFAB, also a program of IUFRO. And it's actually the oldest one since 1983, working with colleagues, science community in Africa, Asia, and Latin America on very different issues, and of course trying to contribute to improving science, as well as also, of course, with this also improving implementation. As we have heard now, and very in a nutshell from Stephanie and also Pablo, the whole issues of REDD Plus and forest landscape restoration, I would like to take a little bit a different view, which is complementary actually, FLR as a really implementation framework. But at the end of the day, it's really a matter of how local actors, but this of course not only farmer communities, but also plantation companies, all actors in the landscape actually change from business as usual, which actually created that kind of degradation, to something better. Because the outcomes of a good restoration and then sustainable land use, which is ecologically better, has more benefits to people, cleaner water, more biodiversity, actually needs a change in the way the landscape is being managed. Of course, we admit that a lot of different things need to change in the supply chains, in higher levels from policy, but also many things need to change on the ground. Having said that, SPDC has tested, or at least piloted, a concept which we call capacity development of forest landscape restoration facilitators on the ground, where you have people who are trusted by those actors. This can be very different. In Central Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, very different actors, but who are somehow on the landscape scale accepted by different stakeholders to drive that kind of communication process to co-develop solution what means restoration in a particular context. Because if we don't have on board people who actually shape the landscape, we will never reach a certain level of restoration. That kind of driving, or at least facilitating these discussions and this communication and this interaction between the stakeholders will then lead to some sort of joint decisions what to do in forest, on the agriculture fields, in the interface between. And important is here that these actors, of course, need to incorporate this new way of first of restoring and then newly managing these areas into their business models, into their income frames, and so on. So with these kind of facilitators, we feel that a lot of things can be achieved. On top of that, it can also be achieved to bring new knowledge in. So if these facilitators are informed about better ways of biodiversity conservation, enhancing biodiversity, having new methods and approaches to clean up water, to have, let me say, a better recycling system, and so on, crop systems, name it, even energy systems which are more compatible with existing forest and tree resources, then of course this is innovation which will be brought into the field and at some point been accepted or at least tried out and tested by local stakeholders. We have two projects, one in Malawi and one in Sri Lanka, where we try to do that actually in Sri Lanka as a model with a lot of NGOs really working with the farmers community on integrating trees into agriculture, which is so important because of the drylands in East Africa, green schools, then energy saving stove, riverbank rehabilitation as elements within that landscape restoration. In the opposite, in Sri Lanka, we work more with the government because a lot of land, because of history, is actually managed by the government. But here, removing invasive species for improving wildlife habitat is one thing can be done on government land. However, if it comes to the wildlife and biodiversity corridor through agriculture fields and plantations, that interaction and good collaboration is needed with the stakeholders, as well as find ways and means that these wildlife and biodiversity corridors can be established. So fencing elephants and all these kind of issues which are cropping up actually when you deal with these things in a country which is highly populated and the land is intensively being used. The experience so far are quite good actually because these facilitators, they understand the overall concept of the landscape approach. They are open, obviously, also to getting new information in and bring this information then to the stakeholders, and they are discussing this so that the ownership, Stephanie was talking about the ownership of the project, even if it's a suboptimal framework condition in terms of policy financing, is already, the ground can be prepared. So I think that having more of these facilitators in all many different locations in the world, hundreds of thousands and millions of locations actually, could be a good element in the interface between policy and implementation for the good of our landscape in future. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting to hear about these experiences on the ground. And now we move to South America to learn about a different kind of experience on the ground. For that, we have with us Dr. Natalia Nascimento. Dr. Nascimento is a researcher at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and she carried out a stakeholder consultation to understand the views of stakeholders on REDD+ implementation. Natalia, you have the floor.
Participate in this conversation about REDD+ in restoration, which are so interesting, important, and challenging topics. So Dr. Klein highlight many points observed in the stakeholders consultation. So I will do a brief contextualization of Brazil's situation. So I'd like to start by saying that I'm from the Brazilian Amazon. My region is globally recognized for its role in the global climate system, for its rich biodiversity. However, the Amazon has continually suffered pressure from deforestation and forest degradation. For example, in the last 3 years, we lost more than 30,000 square kilometers of forest. And today I'm living in southwest Brazil, in the Atlantic forest biome, that is considered a global biodiversity hotspot that has already lost around more than 8% of its original forest. And today, the Amazon and Atlantic forest are separated by another very important biome, that is the Brazilian savanna, another global biodiversity hotspot that has already lost around 40% of its original vegetation. So I'm saying all these numbers, this value of deforestation, to highlight that we need make a huge effort not only to protect our forest, but also to restore the deforested and the burned forest areas. While in the Amazon today, the legal legislation, the Brazilian legislation requires the conservation of 80% of forest inside all private properties. This requirement in Atlantic forest and Brazilian savanna is only 20%. So these 3 biomes in Brazil, the biggest biomes in Brazil, have different histories, legal contexts, economic aspects, and people very different. So look at this difference, consider the different point of views of local population is crucial for both REDD+ initiatives, such and forestry landscape restoration to have succeed as a project, to be able to improve the life conditions of the people and to help us to transform the way that we are looking at forest. So, as Nelson said, I was the responsible for the stakeholders consultation in Brazil for these 2 reports that we are talking about today. And I traveled more than 3,000 kilometers driving from São Paulo to Belém, the capital of the Pará state. There is the state leading deforestation in the Amazon today. So I crossed Brazil and these 3 fantastic biomes to guarantee that the stakeholders consultation has a good balance of genders, groups, and a good geographic distribution. So I spoke with more than 50 people who shared with me their perspective on REDD+ initiatives and the urgent demand for the insertion of forest landscape restoration in the REDD+ initiatives and the carbon market strategies. So despite the views of these people, the people consulted are different, they are not divergent. So I will quickly highlight 3 main messages resulting from this consultation. The first one is we need to go beyond carbon. Both REDD+ and restoration, forest restoration initiatives need to consider the co-benefits generated by the conservation of the forest and by the forest landscape restoration. This should include services, ecosystem services, since the food and water security, to cultural ecosystem services, for example, considering the sacred values of forestry and the ability of forest to promote human well-being. The second one is strengthening governance and improving social conditions. We know that REDD+ is a very important instrument that guarantees the people receive for the forest conservation. However, in Brazil, the resources and benefits obtained from REDD Plus initiatives need to be better distributed and invested in quality goods. Contracts need to be more transparent and monitored. Thus, this helping to improve the living project, REDD Plus projects help to improve the living conditions of the local population, especially traditional people and smallholders, and this is helping to promote a new sustainable economic activity that in the region that can be competitive with another types of activities that has been deforesting and degrading foresting. The last point is we need to research forest landscape restoration in REDD Plus strategies. This is particularly a common demand in Atlantic forest biome, where the small forest remnant needs restoration to support to be protected, to recover important ecosystem functions. So the demand for restoration is a theme present in all biomes. And the most interesting point is that restoration for the stakeholders is considered an instrument capable to stimulate a change in the way we look at forestry. So can contribute to a change in mentality about forestry, about the nature. So I think that we understand that our society needs to undergo a transformation in favor of the climate, in favor of biodiversity. So the change mentality must be among the pillars of this transformation, and REDD Plus is part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for giving us the views of the people on the ground. It's really interesting to know what they think and how they would like to see the future of the activities. And now we came to the end of the panel discussion, so we have time for questions from the audience. Please post your questions through the Q&A function, and if you are here in person, you can use the QR code that it's being displayed now on the screen. And we have already a few questions here. The first one would be how to make sure that local perspectives are taken into account in future activities. This question seems to be fitting more to Natalia, but if any other panelists would like to contribute to this question, please feel free. Natalia, please.
I believe that it is important to create spaces for civil society, especially for the local population to participate in decision-making process. And this space needs to be effective. That is, local population needs to have a decision-making power and not to try negotiate with private and agribusiness sectors, for example. So in recent years in Brazil, civil society lost space in important decision-making forums, especially in the matters related to natural resource management. It is including REDD Plus initiatives, REDD Plus policies in Brazil. So I think that when we create spaces for people involved in the ground of this project to participate, give opinion, and help to plan new strategies, we are investing in the success of REDD Plus and forest restoration as well. And we are recognizing that these people have a crucial role in the conservation of the forest and the all benefits that this can be generated. I don't know if someone I'd like to contribute to this research, this response. Sorry.
If any other of the speakers wants to add anything.
Did I answer your question, Nelson?
I think you did, but it's always good to give the chance to others to add to what you already mentioned. I think it was a good answer. And then
maybe just to complement, can I just say a couple of words? And I'm sure Michael can add some more about the facilitation level. But one thing that struck me in what Natalia was saying as well is the importance of having a team or some people that are trustworthy at that level as well, because frequently you've got the external drivers, the people who are driving a restoration process, for example, or a REDD+ process, who aren't known to the local groups that are actually living in the landscape and having to deal with both deforestation and restoration, both sides of the coin. So there is a really important role for the people who can win the trust and who can understand and who maybe come from the local community and who can facilitate that process. That is really important, I think, as well.
Thank you, Stephanie. I fully agree that trust is fundamental in these cases.
But if there's something that I think there's need to add to that response about how you support local participation, right? Because I think part of that has to do with what's the capacity of local organizations that they may have to have political influence on the ground and be able to expand the multi-stakeholder processes, which we know that already is not enough to have a seat on the table, but also how is that seat in the table can really translate into having a voice on those processes. But something that is quite relevant for me is also related to financial resources and really make an effort from multilaterals, donors, investors to really build mechanisms and channels through which resources could be managed and controlled by local communities or local organizations, because that's critical. Who has control of budget, resources, on how those processes are going to unfold in practice, along these other factors that Michael and Stephanie and Natalia have stressed out, the importance of having these neutral brokers or facilitators as well.
Thank you, Pablo. And actually, since you are on the spot, we have another question that might be better suited for you. But of course, as before, if any other panelist wants to answer, feel free. The question is, how can funding be best channeled to local restoration efforts, especially ones that are focused on food security? Should I repeat the question?
Nelson, can you repeat it? I couldn't hear it fully, actually. There was some break in the audio.
Sure, I repeat. How can funding be best channeled to local restoration efforts, especially the ones that are focused on food security? Was it better now, or should we write it on the chat?
Yes, your voice is not good to us.
I think that the question has been posted on the chat, so it will be easier for you to follow it.
Maybe I just wanted to start and referring to what in the previous question had been said, that power of cooperatives or organizations representing the large smallholder community in whatever form you call them, Latin America, Asia, and so on. I just want to compare this a little bit with the so-called social housing in other countries. You know, many families, even in industrial countries, would not afford to have a flat or own a flat if there would not be this housing as an important element and right to people also to have a decent accommodation. If this would be on a free market, forget it. And the same, I think, powerful organization actually arranging that. They are sitting with the same power on the table on the political agendas, and this is important, supported by political parties and governments. So I think that kind of institutions are also needed, and then the funding, of course, will naturally go also to these smallholders in probably much better way than it is today. Thanks.
Many thanks, Michael. If anyone wants to add to that.
I just wanted to say that probably there's no one solution fits all, and all depends on already what are the financial architectures that you have in different places and what's the capacity of organizations to be able to aggregate the demand for financial services. I think the one critical aspect is also the possibility to combine public with private funds and as Michael was saying, make those resources affordable for the different groups, because some groups may even not be able to get access to those resources, or probably they are already in default with banks, so they will not be able to get those resources. So it really, there's a need to tailor these financial services to the need of these different local groups. But I think that's connected also with what Natalia was saying, that people in these different places also, they are looking for economic options that are sustainable. And it's not just of injecting more resources in places, but it's really building what are these economic options that can be more sustainable in the future and are going to be able to restore these landscapes, and restore their livelihoods, etc. So I think it's a good question, but it's a difficult question as well to reply or to answer.
Thank you, Pablo. I agree with you. It's a difficult question to answer, but you did very well, all of you. And if we move on with the next question. Yes, the next question is how to channel the information we are discussing and learning here to have it implemented, how to channel it to our local leaders worldwide, local or worldwide. How to channel it to our local leaders to have it implemented. So basically, how to channel the information we are discussing here so it can reach the local leaders so they can implement it. Who wants to take on the lead on this question? I think it will be posted on the chat. Yeah, Michael, please.
Well, I mean, as I'm representing a global organization, we represented science community in more than 120 countries with 650 member organizations. Of course, definitely this is a task, and UFO also tries this, because the scientific work is one thing, but the task of many of our members are to translate this into approaches and into ways of land use, forestry, tree-based management for the better of the land use in their jurisdiction or in their countries or provinces. So I think one can only send this around, and with these different knowledge sharing workshops, for example, UFO is doing, but also the digging up the complexities in the GFAP as synthesizing information, of course, would all be helpful, but of course translating it into the local context is then the next challenge one always has, to filter this out, what is suitable and what is not suitable. And Pablo mentioned this already, this in the political governance context might not be suitable, certain things which are very suitable in other places. So I think global organizations are challenged here to do utmost possible to bring it to the different members and institutions worldwide. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
I would just like, sorry, Nelson,
No,
I
go
just
ahead.
thought I would add as well, I think one of the important points, and if we remember that timescale I was showing, it took 10 years for FLR to really take off in some ways. And part of the reason, I think, is because it takes time to establish the links. FLR doesn't take place in a vacuum, neither does REDD+. There's linkages with other activities, with other priorities, with other transformations that have to take place. And so establishing those links, I think, is very important transforming the way we implement our forest restoration or our priorities for climate change mitigation in the forest sector. So taking the time to establish those links and to seeing what we can latch onto that's already happening or that's already moving, I think is very important as well to start translating theory into practice.
Many thanks, Michael and Stephanie. And we have time for one more question. The question is, how can current REDD Plus and restoration initiatives further incentivize investment into areas that already have low rates of deforestation? Anyone?
May I just start?
Yeah.
I think even that term, an area or region with low deforestation, in these kind of dramatic changes of climate and those catastrophes we have seen, doesn't mean everything is fine with the environment. We see this in high forested countries where bark beetle attacks, fire, and many things attack now existing vegetations, but in some parts even the sequestration function of the forest is actually being reduced. Some of the models show there will even be sources of carbon in the long term. So that means that term high and low deforestation regions is not anymore a distinction between where restoration is needed. We need restoration from soils to species composition, probably, and other means and other in many of these areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone wants to add to this answer?
I would just add that's where the importance of understanding the science as well. An organization like IUPRO that's also promoting understanding what's the science behind some of these decisions, and the science also means looking forward. And so if we can anticipate some of these changes, then that adds to the value of a solution like restoration.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, and I would say that's probably the next question that we all have to deal with, because also there's understanding about that there's some kind of hierarchy on mitigation actions, and there have been papers on that. That we should first prioritize conservation, then sustainable management, and then restoration. But unfortunately, the mechanisms that we have now, they have, from a carbon lenses, prioritize avoiding deforestation, and also we move to restoration. But still, we don't have enough resources that are supporting to those local stewards of natural ecosystems and forests. There are some financial mechanisms to channel resources to protected areas. Now there's this whole discussion about OECNs and how also to provide more incentives and financial resources for these local stewards of nature. But I think that's a big question on the debate, how to mobilize more resources to conservation and to those areas that have low rates of deforestation, and how can we protect and sustain those resources in the long term, which are going to be critical for supporting biodiversity in the future.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you all for your answers. And sadly, we are running out of time, so we will have to end the discussion here. But for those who want more information, I let you know that you can find more information about all these topics in the IUFRO website. And you can also find some information in the digital booth we have here in the GLF. And with that, I would like to thank all our speakers for sharing their knowledge with us. I'm sure we all have learned some things today. And I would also like to thank the audience for joining us here. And I would like to ask for an applause for our speakers.
Thank you.